Hey, Archers, this is going to be a really informal, semi-off the cuff, semi-not off the cuff episode. So we are not doing a full breakdown of Wake Up Dead Man in this, but we are going to talk about it. We're not going to do a breakdown of other films, but we are going to talk about some. And we are probably going to have some like high-level questions we've been thinking about in terms of faith, media, and that intersection in this episode. So this is going to be more raw, authentic conversation than organized outline podcast. So if you're looking for that one, this ain't going to be it. Hopefully it's still valuable and enjoyable. So with that,
we'll still try to chop it up too.
Yes. Yes. So with that, Femi was just starting to tell us that he was on a podcast with High Point Church talking specifically about Wake Up Dead Man with their youth pastor, Preston, who's a connection of ours and has been an encourager of what we've been doing. So we're thankful for him. But why don't you pick up there? So Preston invited you to talk about Wake Up Dead Man. And I think his premise or his framing was really interesting of what he wanted to talk about in regards to the movie. So go for it.
So a little bit about also where I've been, because people are like, hey, Femi is back on a podcast. Interesting. We had the fortune of adding to our family another little baby who's 9 months old right now at the time of this recording. And so just whirlwind of things in life and sickness and having another like little person to worry about and try to balance. And I like all the project management I know from my job, does not apply to my personal life in the way that it should to, run it efficiently. So I Preston Bosley, who's been on this podcast before, he said, hey, I'm the director of communications at High Point. I talk a lot with Preston and Paxton, confusing names. Paxton's the
sorry. I was thinking of Paxton. That's right. I was like, what is it?
Paxton's actually been on some of our content in the past too.
Yes.
But he's like, hey, let's talk about Wake Up Dead Man, which just came out towards the end of last year. Knives Out 3. Ryan Johnson who's the director and writer of those films, grew up in the church. And this is sort of I don't know if it's the end of the series, but it's part of this trilogy of these movies he has. And he wanted to really focus on this conflict in church. And Preston said, hey, do you believe that this movie was a Christian movie or not? And I was like, oh no, like just immediately. And he said, we should talk about this. And maybe this would be good for the church to talk about. We actually had a men's event recently at church. And one of the things I realized is our content, we don't want to be combative or tell people like, hey, this is the way you should think through things. But it's not up everybody's alley. If you're somebody who likes super, super clean stuff, you're probably not listening this far into our podcast catalog. But for Preston and for me, we saw that the main character in Wake Up Dead Man was this earnest person who claimed to be a Christian. His father, Judd Duplessis. And he was more of the main character than the detective in this murder mystery of Benoit Blanc.
Yeah.
And there are all these other characters that touch on different tropes in Christianity. And he was of the mind, like, this is sort of a Christian movie. Now, my defense for myself of me saying, no, it's not a Christian movie, is although the main character is vindicated and there is truth and you see redemption in some ways through the story of the movie is not doing two things, I think. It's not clean. There's some language in it, although there's no sex, and there's some violence in it, although it's not gratuitous. But it's not saying, hey, the gospel is the answer to this. It's still saying that the answers of this are real, hard fought investigation, etc. And questions. The main character, though, Judd, is earnest in his faith and really trying to use his faith to guide his actions. And you can see that he's not doing the things that are the most advantageous for him. And so we talked about that. Again, my defense is, if you go to Subway and there's like a 15-year-old who just came to faith and they make your sandwich, is that a Christian sandwich? And the answer is nobody thinks it's a Christian sandwich.
Sure.
So even if a Christian makes a movie, even if that movie is really good, it doesn't necessarily make it a Christian movie because of the way we use the word in modern parlance. So I think that we have to think about Christian stuff differently, and we'll probably talk about that later on in another shorter section. But in the movie, Judd is accused of murdering Monsignor Wicks, played by Jeff Brolin. And I'm going to forget the main character actor's name, Josh Jacobs, or maybe it is,
I think it's something like that.
Judd, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And Jeff, I'm going to miss the name. Josh Brolin plays Monsignor Wicks, Father Wicks, Jefferson Wicks. And he is this just fire and brimstone-ish preacher through the movie, and he has this cabal of people around him who sort of support him as this church is dying. He basically is shunning a lot of people who are coming to church by having a brazen attitude, and doesn't like Judd because he feels like Judd is trying to take over his church. But he ends up dying, and the entire thing is, well, he and Judd didn't get along. He's a suspect. All these people around him are suspects. And we went through in the podcast for High Point and said that each of the characters is a caricature of a certain type of person and how they glom onto faith. There's a very devout person. There are sycophantic people. There are people who are hoping for God to heal them. There are people who are just there because people they care about are there. There are people who are thinking that God will fix things if they're on the right side of it. And this charismatic, powerful communicator sort of leading them along this line so that he can sort of prop up himself. And it's a problem like systemically, and this is why a lot of people are looking for more liturgical churches, churches where it's not so based off of your charisma and your communication, because it's a temptation for a lot of young men who are good communicators, especially if they're growing up in faith, to use those skills, to use that charisma, to use that boldness to lead a congregation in a way and then feel protective of what they've built. Yeah. Instead of continuing to try to spread the gospel. And you see Judd is foiled by Jefferson Wicks because he's coming from a boxing background and trying to understand, how do I live a sacrificial life? So having this sacrificial life character who's earnest in it, who is a really good example of it, who while in the middle of a murder investigation stops to try to help somebody who's going through just an emotional issue with their mother and their family. All of that seems like a very generous and gracious nod by someone who doesn't claim to be a believer in Rian Johnson of this is what an earnest example of faith looks like. Sure. And Benoit Blanc, played by Daniel Craig, he's the investigator, the special investigator brought in to help solve this mystery. And he is a outright atheist. He does not believe this at all. But you can see him moved at various times by Judd's earnestness, kindness, patience. And so Preston just asked, like, is this a Christian movie? And I'm like, no, but it does put, a version of genuine Christianity in a good light. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's it's not the point of the movie. But you see that a lot of people who've been rubbed wrong by Christians who are not in it for community with God or love of God, who are not in the faith for just the edification of others, the support of others, their sacrifice they make makes them jealous, etc. It's important for you, if you're going to watch Wake Up Dead Men, to know there's some language. There's a little bit of violence. There's no sex, nothing gratuitous. There is a woman who is scantily clad, we will say, in Jefferson Wick's mom, who the movie sort of starts with his grandfather being the preacher at this church, his mom being more promiscuous, having him out of wedlock, and waiting for her father to die to inherit all his money that he supposedly has. And him, and when he dies, not having any money to give. And so 2 generations later, Jefferson, who's now an old man, he doesn't have this money, and even tells Judd, he's like, I'm sort of jealous of, some of these people who have all this stuff. The longevity of faith is hard, and we should pray for our pastors because having longevity of faith is hard. But this movie does show not a naive version of it, but a tried version of a person being earnest in their faith. And it never really talks about the gospel. Like the most they sort of have is like he opens his arms out. That's opening my arms is more like Jesus than putting my fists up, and I should have some self-control around that. So that's sort of what we talked about. In a nutshell, taking 45 minutes, 50 minutes of conversation into 7 minutes.
The shorts version, the Instagram mega cut. Totally.
But we want people to watch it in our congregation, because we should be challenging ourselves to think, like, why do I go to church? Why do you go on a Sunday? If you're going to get up and not go to brunch, or get up and not just like watch football, or go like sit around your house and do nothing, why are you going? Why are you volunteering? Why are you doing the things you're doing? If you're not re-examining it and refreshing it, you sometimes will forget to repent for the areas in which your faith represents just an obedience to the local custom and the local culture of what church looks like, and forget that that is not what church looks like all over the world.
Yeah.
And so the movie helps you challenge, like, am I somebody in the middle of a case that's going to put me down? Really, am I really going to ask or stop and ask somebody how they're doing?
Yeah.
Am I really going to slow down to care for people? Am I really going to, potentially just sort of give them and go like, hey, all the evidence points towards me. And if this is what God has for me, this is what happens. And that's a question we should be asking ourselves when we're doing this stuff. Not how can we all become rich Christians one day who, like everything is easy for.
Buy our bunkers.
CEO
style. Yeah.
So I think there's a challenge for you in faith if you're like, well, I'm just trying to do the right thing. I'm trying to do the thing that's expected of me. I'm trying to do the thing that's going to get me to the next step, or redefine my life. Christ's sacrifice redefines your life. Your behavior is an outpouring of the thing that already redefined your life. You don't try to redefine your life. You are self-actualizing, not like the world self-actualizes. You're self-actualizing into what God says you are, and trying to figure out what he says and how he wants you to live, and being dedicated to that. And that might have some twists and turns in it, but it's more than, well, now that you're a believer, you're supposed to do these things that the local church you go to expects of you. And the movie shows the damage when that happens.
Yeah.
So
totally.
Okay, I'm going to pause there.
Yeah.
And leave room for questions about that.
Interesting. So I hard disagree. I thought it was a very much a Christian movie, but I'm going to frame it up against, frame it up to a conversation. So I feel like this is our shout out and building up other podcast kind of episode. So check out we'll make sure we link to the one that Femi had a discussion with Preston. And then over the summer, I connected with Josias and Hadid, who they run the Cinema Theology podcast. So they have been doing a lot of content on Instagram. So if you're big into Instagram, like definitely check out their stuff. But in our conversation, we were just kind of like wrestling and grappling with this question of what makes a work of art Christian, and like how do we as Christians, without giving ourselves permission to engage potentially like dangerous material, so like really extreme example, I'll just say like adult films or something like that, we would say as Christians, like that's a no-go no matter what. There's not an argument to be made that is a kind of work, like quote unquote work of art that you can like find redemption in because of the dehumanizing nature and how humans are represented and stuff like that. But when we talk about movies and like quote unquote secular movies, we were saying that it gets messy because if we're truthful, we have something like the scriptures, which are a lot of stories, historical, poetic, satire, and like Jonah, that showcase a lot of depravity. There's a lot of brokenness and violence, but there's also this thread of like redemption and pointing to an ultimate higher truth and way of being and way of godliness that is manifested and shown through Christ, and how he is like the ultimate king and he is the only one of worship and like all that stuff. And so our discussion led to this question that I was meaning to be a little bit like poking the bear, which they both actually ended up agreeing was, let's say from a certain framework, the Bible is the only quote unquote Christian work of art because it is the inspired word of God that is purely intended to point to the death, resurrection, and kingship of Jesus over all things. Let's say that that's the Christian work of art. What if everything else, no matter what, from Michael W. Smith to Quentin Tarantino to Bad Bunny, to Kendrick to whoever, everything else is on a human continuum that really it isn't in this like Christian, non-Christian, sacred, secular, but has just a different artistic representation of God's truth. Some are more literal and direct, hence like a Michael W. Smith song, which we would probably sing in church, and something maybe like Wake Up Dead Man, which doesn't maybe use the gospel as the answer to the movie, but even in a scene that and just kind of like knowing we were having this discussion went back to is when Judd and I always forget his name. I just was joking that it was James Bond. Like James Bond and Judd
Benoit
are talking
Blanc?
in the Benoit Blanc.
Yeah. Okay.
They're in the woods, and there's this really cool moment that was the moment to me that I was like, oh, this is what you're doing, Rain Johnson. Like, I do feel like there's a little bit of Christian movie in this. Is the way Judd describes his faith was like, this is different than just making it like, well, God is good and God is blah, 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 and this like caricatured, non-Christian take of Hollywood. Judd specifically says, when I got into, he's talking about the murder, right? And he says, when I got into the ring, I wanted to kill that guy. Like I killed him, but it was like, yes, I physically killed him, but I wanted to kill him in my heart. And that was the thing that I needed. I don't remember his exact quote, but like that was the sin or like the evil. And there was this point in that moment that Judd is pointing to like Christian faith and the truth being that we're being saved from our hearts and that there's like this heart level thing. So my argument is not necessarily, I would even
you're like removing labels in a way.
Yeah, I'm kind of trying and specifically
go ahead.
I'm specifically doing it because I feel like we get into, and this is where I think we could have a fun conversation about this because it sounds like we have different perspectives, is the reason I think that we as Christians should be thinking about doing that is, again, not to create for us a dangerous slope of now we can engage anything and everything, because I don't think that that's what we should do. I think that breaks the biblical character of discernment and like which we're supposed to have. But I do think what it can do is help us to actually be a little bit more artistically literate, to then, instead of focusing on the label and who's making something and why are they making it, to what is the actual content of the piece. And when I watch something like Wake Up Dead Man, yes, there's profanity, yes, there's an intensity to the movie and a rawness, but I would argue that the idea that like Judd has to go through this vindication process, that Benoit is having to wrestle with, like, not necessarily do I become a Christian or not, but just the idea of someone being passionate about truth and love and being willing to put up with all of this nonsense around them for the sake of all these other people. And yet he's being dragged through the mud, and like watching Judd's example, like, to me, the term Christian movie feels like it just doesn't help. Like, it's not a helpful term. So
I think
that's my argument.
Genre help.
Go for it.
I think it's a genre helping thing. I don't think it's a necessity. What we do when we label things is to try to help people understand, like, what's country music versus hip hop music.
Sure.
Because if I say if it's spectrum, that's true. There's a truth to that. But you do it for labels, and I think for Christian, the reason why so many things in my mind are not Christian pieces is because Christians are really referring about people, and people who are acting like little Christs. That's what the word means, coming from their belief in Jesus Christ for salvation. Yeah. So like the reason I get so narrow is because I think sometimes Christians and even non-Christians want to call something Christian when it is clean or nice or family friendly. Even Christian radio stations won't say it's a Christian. They'll be like, say for the whole family. Because they're trying to figure out, how do we talk about things that celebrate Jesus, the Bible, the gospel, and are clean of sexual vulgarity and language vulgarity and physical vulgarity. Like, that's what we use as a label to help people. I think that if I go in that and go deeper, just because something has that does not mean it's Christian.
Right. I was like, Cocomelon isn't about Jesus. So like,
right. I'll say that the parables of Jesus are not necessarily, not all of them are explicitly Christian.
Sure.
Most of them are because he is saying these are what the kingdom of heaven is like. I'm specifically tying this to God. But Samson killing a bunch of people with a donkey's jawbone, that's biblical, but it's not necessarily Christian if I take the boundaries of it and put them here and here, right?
Yeah.
Or David killing a bunch of people, killing a bunch of Philistines and bringing Saul their foreskins.
Right.
That's biblical, but it's not necessarily a very clear picture of who Jesus is, and his life is the answer to your life. So for me, if you're calling me a believer, what I'm saying when I say I am a Christian and what I hold the artwork to, so that way it is more free to say all artwork is a little bit more on this sort of continuum, is if it's not explicitly saying that Jesus is God and you need to believe in him for your salvation because of your sin, then I'm like, did the movie say that to the audience? And I'm like, no, it didn't. It's not as preachy as that. And because it's not as preachy as that, it just shows this light of an example, and that it's the same thing as me when I go into work, hopefully. Like, hopefully I am a light and you see me as a Christian represented at my work. It doesn't make my work Christian. It doesn't make my job and the PowerPoint that I send out Christian. It doesn't make the sandwich that I make or the lunch that I bring. And that's where these two ideas sort of combine. Of, I want to be able to tell if a person is a Christian or not. And even that takes me being and living with them long enough to see how they're living. And are they living consistently going back to God, to the Bible, to church, to guidance about like what this pillar of Christ dying and resurrecting is. And so it's me saying, I disagree, but I agree with the labels that we put on art. Those are not always helpful because of how the English language is a little nebulous, and sometimes we cross genres. Like Old Town Road by Lil Nas X. Is that a country song? Right. Yeah. And how people got so ticked off by it. Yeah. Or people not knowing that Puerto Rico is a part of the United States.
Don't get it started.
Right. Like,
I'm kidding. Yeah.
We are just very, very bad at labels. So mine, to sort of like stick it to people, is just really, really specific so that you can allow a VeggieTales episode to be seen and experienced, and you have to think about it, like you said, in terms of artistic literacy, before you just get to label it as Christian or not Christian. Like, if it's not very, very explicit, then you have to look at it again. And you should look at it again.
No, you know? Following up with that, like, I hear where your distinction is, and I actually would probably say I would agree, or at least be willing to agree with something closer to that. Because as you're sharing, I think the thing that was coming to my mind is like, okay, why do I get defensive about this idea of Christian literacy and like why we get so freaky about certain works of art in the church and stuff like that? And I think at the core, it's because it feels like the label of Christian is weaponized to vindicate us from having to engage and understand culture. Again, not for the sake of quote unquote being in the world and stuff like that, but to actually wrestle with like what is happening in the story of Wake Up Dead Man, and how can it actually, and maybe should it be challenging me? Like there's a level of absolution from, I don't think I'm using the right word, absolving. We're absolving ourselves from having to actually think critically, to actually potentially be literate and thinking of, I'm more and more convinced of, especially with like the younger generation, of pop culture and media as a language. And if you're not able to speak it because you're saying, well, that's sinful, that's wicked, that's worldly, and we should have no place in talking about that, it feels like something that we're just trying to get out of, versus I think what you're saying is, sure, we can absolutely have, maybe, I mean, just as like the litmus test that, and I mean, you could even say something like Chronicles of Narnia isn't inherently Christian because it's not literally Jesus who's doing the saving, it's Aslan. Yes, Aslan is a fill-in, and the White Witch is the fill-in for Satan, and like the whole narrative is built to be allegorical to the Christian story.
Yeah.
But like that's not the same thing as a Christian Christ is Lord, Christ does the saving, there is no hope outside of him story. And it's interesting to think about the marketing side of even like stories and stuff, because I think that was my fascination with the idea of Wake Up Dead Man and labeling it a Christian story is what would that do to Christians internally who struggle with this idea of watching a quote unquote secular movie and then have to have this idea of like, this movie, I've heard this is a Christian movie, and would that almost suddenly recontextualize their experience with it and allow them to maybe ease up a little bit? And like, there's some stuff, there's some language, but like, actually, I saw this moment. Actually, this thing was said. Actually, this thing was like this level of depravity that seems really biblical, like to your, what you're saying earlier. So
let me pause real quick
go
because just for time for our shorter episodes, let's continue this conversation. We'll continue this conversation on Christians sort of reacting to the marketing around this label. But we both suggest you listen to, or suggest you watch Wake Up Dead Man if you're of a certain level of discipleship and discernment. But let's get on to this exact question that you're talking about, Josh, for like the next like 25 minutes or so of how we feel about these labels and how they're used and what that means.
Let's do it.
This episode was produced by Josh Erickson, Josh Cook, and Femi Chokwera, and edited by Josh Erickson. Our social media producer is Colton Mefford. We are currently self-supported. You can check out short stories, merch, and highlighted creators at parablearrows.com. You can also find us on Instagram and TikTok at Parablearrows or support us on Patreon. Thank you for listening to the Parable Arrows podcast. Think, move in faithfulness, and trust God. Pull back, aim high, let it fly.